have your attention again, everyone? I'd now like to introduce the second of our pairs of conversationists, and I'm pleased that we have Margaret Hillenbrand, who is Associate Professor of Modern Chinese Literature and Culture. She's going to be in conversation with Adriana X Jacobs, who is Associate Professor and Cowley Lecturer in Modern Hebrew Literature. They're going to be speaking about Margaret's research on the relationship between suppressed histories, public secrecy, and the aesthetic realms in contemporary China.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak today, and thank you to Adriana for agreeing to be the conversation partner. I'm going to talk for a very short time about the general outlines of my project, just to give you an idea of what it's about, and then Adriana and I will talk in more detail about the ideas, the implications for aesthetic practice that the project raises. So what I look at in the book that I've just finished is the idea that contemporary China has some missing histories. By this I mean events and episodes that, because of their political sensitivity, have been commemorated either not at all or only very fitfully in public culture, despite their incalculable impact. The particular case studies that I look at are the Nanjing Massacre of 1937, which went undiscussed in China for decades after the event. The Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1976, which can be discussed in only certain fixed ways today, and the Tiananmen Square protests and subsequent violent crackdown of 1989, which cannot be discussed really in contemporary China at all. I'm not trying to suggest here that this is an uncommon or undocumented phenomenon. Historians across the globe have probed these sorts of let's call them the protocols of disavowal, whether this is the studious neglect of Britain's imperial history until very recently, perhaps still today, the ongoing denial in certain quarters of Japanese society of its militaristic past, and the pall of silence that fell over aspects of the partition of India, just to give a few examples. And historians who work on these areas have tried to understand how this kind of renunciation calcifies into social fact. In the case of China, which is my key interest, what we see is a narrative dominated by the state. This is the idea that these histories are censored by the state apparatus until they fade from mind or can only live on in the moulded, disciplined, tamed ways that the state permits. So they're omitted from school textbooks, they're deleted from social media accounts, they're banned in books and films until the red-hot core of these sorts of events suffers a commemorative attrition, which results, or so this narrative goes, in a slow amnesia. I don't find this narrative very satisfying, but it's extraordinarily prevalent in cultural media and academic accounts of China's potholed consciousness of its past. In my book, I try to suggest that this top-down approach, this state-dominated approach, is missing a dimension, and that the disavowal of history in contemporary China actually has many stakeholders, whether they are willing or otherwise, and whether they're affiliated to the state or not. And the reason for this, I think, is that extreme events are very seldom forgotten by those who lived through them or even witnessed them. However diligently the state may apply itself to the task of censorship, and however keenly individuals may crave release from their appalling memories. So what then happens to that red-hot core? How is it contained? How is it cooled? Well, in my book, I suggest that public secrecy, what Michael Taussig calls that which cannot be said but which is generally known, or more simply knowing what not to know, is an unacknowledged force structuring socio-political life in China today. And I'm trying to move away from this censorship plus amnesia narrative to suggest that the hushing of histories is actually a densely collective endeavour in China. That these silences are, and I don't mean this in the least bit judgmentally, these silences are conspiratorial. And when we start thinking about how these sorts of events that I've talked about, the Nanjing Massacre, the Cultural Revolution, the Tiananmen Square massacre, in terms of public secrecy, then I think we get a different set of angles on how the past is processed or not processed in China. Because public secrecy is a very multifaceted thing. In an obvious sense, it's a self-defensive thing, since there are grave sanctions against those who speak out. It's also protective in the sense that elders won't share stories with the young for fear of initiating them into knowledge that can be dangerous. It's preeminently social, because generational cohorts or other kinds of closed communities come together in deciding not to talk. It's pragmatic. Let's let sleeping dogs lie is the ethos here. Who wants another cultural revolution? It's also embarrassed, because calling out awkward truths can be self-shaming, and in many cases people would rather forget what they did back then. And above all, perhaps, I think public secrecy can be palliative, therapeutic. It's a form of repair which has fallen out of fashion in our confessionally exhibitionist culture, in our culture which assumes that truth will always lead to reconciliation. Either way, public secrecy, unlike the rigidity of censorship or the flaccidity of amnesia, is a highly mindful thing. People obey the law of omerta for a range of shifting reasons. But just to sort of wind up this summary a bit, studying secrecy of any kind is very difficult. It's tough to trace, it's tough to tackle, because secrecy naturally repels inquirers. It's hardwired to resist research. And these sorts of problems naturally escalate in hardcore cryptocratic environments, such as China, a place where we have sealed archives, closed trials, disappeared dissidents, let alone the vast online militia of online cops who patrol the Great Firewall. These obstacles can seem like a roadblock to the whole endeavour. And public secrecy is even more intransigent, since the strategy which we would normally use against it, namely exposure, barely works against things that are broadly known already. Think of WikiLeaks, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and the civil strife which they have singularly failed to spark. But what I try and suggest in my book is that we can actually study secrecy in China. It's productive to do so, if, and particularly if we do so via the aesthetic realm and via the role of aesthetic practices.
So in the part of your project that I read on remaking Tank Man in visual culture, you look at sort of remixing and how a lot of this resistance to public secrecy relies on certain aesthetic practices in visual culture. So I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the functions that aesthetic practice assumes in a cryptocratic environment, and particularly the role of new media and digital technologies in both shaping and creating these functions.
Sure. Well, I think the key point here is that art and literature have always had the capacity to deliver encoded, encrypted messages. We see this everywhere in Western culture, from the labyrinth floor of Chartres Cathedral to the genre of the roman à clé to Leonardo's visual puns, and to all the many painters from Van Eyck to Picasso who've smuggled hidden self-portraits into their paintings. Art and literature have always had this capacity, but I think its potential really ramps up in the sorts of environments you're talking about, in secretive, suppressive environments, where the duty of articulation does often fall on aesthetic communities, for the simple reason that they can reach audiences that other social actors can't, in ways that other social actors can't. And this is never more true than, as you say, in the digital world. An example of this is the brief flowering of cartoon art, which occurred in China after the launch of China's Twitter equivalent, Weibo, in 2009. After that launch, there was a concentrated stream of political cartoons which satirized, which lampooned really, the regime in highly acerbic, highly encrypted ways. And these cartoonists exploited the potential of drawn satire to evade the kind of keyword searches that censors were using to reach new constituencies of followers. Now, of course, the state does catch up in the end, and these sorts of cartoons, that sort of content was in due course deleted. But there's a critical time lag between the posting of a subversive cartoon and its tracking down by the censors, in which new communities, new followers can be reached and messages can be disseminated. The problem, of course, is, as I've just suggested, that the state does catch up. And the four main cartoonists, which I look at in the chapter that Adriana kindly read for me, have all, first of all, been hounded off Weibo and onto Twitter, but more importantly, they've been hounded out of China itself, and they now have to live and work under aliases overseas. So that's one of the problems, the short-term nature of what digital platforms can offer. Mm-hmm. But there are other possibilities.
And could you maybe speak a little more about how you use the term remediation, and specifically photographic repurposing, work as strategies for artists, activists who want to take on the unsayable? Because as you said, that extreme events are rarely forgotten by those who have experienced them, but also the ways in which the next generation is also able to participate in these sort of repurposings and thereby rememberings of extreme events that they were not directly experiencing.
Right. Well, in my book, I look at one particular category of aesthetic objects that deal with secrecy, and these are works which repurpose or remediate, as you say, well-known historic photographs, or iconic genres of photographs from China's modern past. The events I've talked about, the Nanjing Massacre, the Cultural Revolution, the Tiananmen Square crackdown, these have all struggled for open speech over the years, but they've nonetheless left astonishing traces on the photographic record, images which really arrest the viewer. And in the past, these images have been hidden in archives, they've been classified, they've been suppressed, but in recent years, via different kinds of transfer, they have begun to emerge from deep cover. And as they've broken the surface, artists, filmmakers, sculptors, writers have seized on these images and repurposed them in ink, paint, celluloid, codex, mural, the digital image, fabric, even human skin, with whatever material really that's come most readily to hand. And in my book, I call these objects photoforms, and I suggest that they have a particular role. They're particularly adept at drawing the unsayable out into reflective thought, into speech, and possibly even into action, as you suggest. I'll give you an example of this. Well, the thing I really noticed about these works as I got to study them more is obviously there's a lot of deciphering going on here. The very act of repurposing means to regarb an original image in a new guise. And in that sense, the visual field ends up bristling with different clues and codes that the reader has to work out for himself or herself. But more than this, these are works which often enjoin a more activated kind of response from spectators, to get back to what you were saying about younger generations. They require their viewers to step up and get more involved. And one example of this, which I found very evocative, is a photo book which was produced by the well-known Beijing artist Xu Yong in 2014. 25 years earlier, in 1989, he took reams and reams and reams of photographs of the protesters who were demonstrating, sometimes joyfully, in Tiananmen Square. But after the violent crackdown, he buried these images in his personal archives, where they lay for a quarter of a century, gradually fading to yellow. But then in 2014, he made the momentous decision to bring these images out as a photo book, but not as fully developed photographs, but instead as colour negatives, 64 of them altogether. And I should say at this point that 64 is well-known code in mainland China for the crackdown, which took place on the 4th day of the 6th month. Now, the impact of presenting the images as negatives is quite astonishing, because they go through chromatic and tonal inversions. So light becomes day, day becomes night, green becomes red, and vice versa. And as the viewer makes their way through this book, the impact is startlingly eerie. It seems as if the protests are taking place at night time or in the gloaming, for a start. The bodies of the protesters turn to translucent silhouettes, their eyes become hollow sockets, and the red flags that they're holding up turn to this uncanny malachite colour. And of course, in many ways, this ghostliness is prophetic, because at least some of these protesters would have been captured by his camera in the moments or hours before their deaths. But then you get to the end of the book and you find a set of instructions telling the spectator, the viewer, how to activate the invert colours on an iPhone or a tablet. And when you do that, you can go back through the images, train the camera lens on them, and suddenly all that uncanniness vanishes like a ghost at daybreak, as the images are restored to their original state. And those eyes that were hollow sockets start to radiate light and hope, and the translucent silhouettes of their bodies become flesh and blood, and the banners they hold up become the red of political activism. And so what's going on there is that in order for the viewer to access this secret world, the viewer has to engage on a totally different level with the artwork. This isn't the kind of artwork that permits just a casual gaze. It enjoins, as I say, on the viewer a different level of activated engagement. And as it does so, I think works like this, and there are many, many, many of them that use ploys like this, create spaces, even if they're very ephemeral, even if they're very fragile, in which people can begin to think about why it is that certain things are unsayable. Can we talk about them? Should we talk about them?
We've reached the time for questions.
Right. Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes, Lamajah.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I think it's a really, really important research you're doing. And I'm just interested, you talk about suppressed histories, or missing histories, and I think that's almost an understatement. I'm just wondering if in your China you include peoples like Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, and their histories. If you don't, then what history of China is that?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I have to be upfront with you and say I don't include them. But that's not really because of a desire not to, but because, as you've yourself already suggested, the missing histories are so manifold that I think it would be impossible to do justice to all of them. Even if we were to stick within the boundaries of China as it's conventionally circumscribed, there are many, many missing histories from the 20th century that I don't have time or space to look at.
I wonder if you mentioned them, because otherwise there's a suppressed form of history going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. I do mention them. I mention the fact that the mode of analysis I use, not through choice but rather through necessity, is the case study. And case studies are regretfully but necessarily selective. And I mean, if I could write 3 books on this, then I would need to have a book about the anti-rightist movement. I'd need to have a book about the Great Famine. I'd need to have space to cover the migrant population in China, who constitute the most gigantic ongoing public secret in Chinese contemporary society. And then, of course, there's the raging and most rampant public secret of all, which is that the Scions of the Long Marches are presiding over this hyper-capitalist juggernaut, and calling it socialism with Chinese characteristics. Yes, it's a very salutary point that you raise, and I do touch on it, and I will touch on it even more, thanks to your reminder.
Other questions? Yes, behind you.
Hi, Professor Hillenbrand. I'm just wondering, for a lot of Chinese students, my generation, who were born after 1989, we basically relive the past through these images. We're the post-memory generation who were not there to experience the events themselves. So I wonder, is there a certain tension between the aesthetics of the memory of the survivors and the reanimated aesthetics for the newer generations who are probably the majority who consume the images on the internet?
I think that's another very good question. I think that one of the dangers about having a suppressive environment like this, in which memory has to break free in the paltry ways that it can, is that certain iconic images, such as the Tankman one that we were talking about a little bit earlier, end up assuming a disproportionate importance, and they begin to almost supersede the place of memory with a hyper-familiar, hyper-recognisable image standing in its place. And there's a real danger there of aesthetic reductionism, which I think is what you're alluding to, which is very present. And in the work that I'm doing, I'm very aware that I'm always on the brink of engaging in that kind of aesthetic reductionism. But in a way, this is the inevitable offshoot of a society in which certain things have been rendered taboo. But it's only those images which have a kind of horrific photogenic character that can begin to break through, crack the ice, and gain some kind of traction in the present. But it's a problem that I'm very aware of. Thank you for the question.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question goes back to your initial point that maybe discussions around censorship, control, repression, and the theory of amnesia, collective amnesia, is maybe not enough to explain like these gaps. And so where exactly do you place like the resurface of this new set of photos, or like Zhang Yimou's movie like Coming Back, and the general like resurfacing, let's say, of these events in contemporary Chinese culture? Is it the state loosening up, or is it people feeling more strong and stable and they want to remember, or they do want to pass this information down to the younger generation? Or is it something else entirely?
Well, you can't have an event like the Cultural Revolution, which obviously 1966 to 1976 is in some ways an arbitrary historicising of it, but nonetheless, let's just stick with that framework for the purposes of the discussion. You can't have an event that encompassed so many years and so many people and so many spaces and hope to keep it under a carapace of secrecy forever. So what the state has done, or what the state has permitted, to reference your question more accurately, is to allow certain kinds of mnemonic reflection to come to the surface, perhaps as a sort of in a pacifying way, perhaps in a venting way, but nonetheless there are certain aspects of that event which remain in the darkest places of taboo. So while it's acceptable to give an example, for the sent down youth to publish their memoirs and to hold photographic exhibitions of their time when they were sent to the hinterland of China to work with the peasants, other aspects of Cultural Revolution memory, such as the fact that some of the most violent pitched battles in 1966 were fought by people who are in positions of extreme power and privilege today, those remain secret, and they're easier to keep secret, arguably, if other aspects are allowed some kind of space for articulation. But I think the difference with June 4th is that it's a far more containable event, and that's why the quote-unquote amnesia surrounding it has been so much more complete. The larger the event, the more there are going to be fissures and cracks in the surface that prevent a complete whitewash.
Other questions? I have a question. You spoke about the fact that secrecy is difficult to study. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the trajectory of your own research. So how did you go about studying secrecy? Could you speak a little bit about that, please?
Sure. Well, the research came about because I found myself encountering lots of these objects that I've called photoforms, these objects which repurpose or remediate well-known historic photographs in China. And I felt instinctively, intuitively, without being able to establish this as any kind of fact, that they were more prevalent in China than they were elsewhere. I mean, they are everywhere. An example of them in central London is that bench on Old Bond Street, which has got Roosevelt at one end and Churchill at the other. And the space in between is normally occupied by a tourist looking for a photo opportunity. But actually that bench is modelled on the outer photographs of 1945. And of course there's a large elephant missing from the bench, whose legacy soured the Yalta settlement and who is therefore missing from the bench, which becomes instead slightly disingenuous monument to Anglo-American amity instead of what it really might be. So photo forms are everywhere, but I sense that they were really quite ubiquitous and across different mediums and across different kinds of cultural codes. They're amongst elite expatriated artists who I've talked about a bit today, but also school children make them. They're vernacular practices as well. Sometimes people who are even illiterate will find a scribe and show the scribe a family photograph from the Cultural Revolution and get that scribe to help them compose a narrative around it. So they're a very, very pervasive form of cultural making in China, and I couldn't work out what they were doing. I found them more and more as I looked, but I couldn't put an explanation for them. And then I suddenly realised after interviewing one of the cartoonists I talk about in the article that Adriana read, suggested to me that actually the idea that Tiananmen has been forgotten is a totally constructed myth. That even Tank Man, this image which is totally banned in China and apparently has no recognition value whatsoever on the Chinese mainland, he reminded me something which I'd forgotten, which was that pictures of Tank Man were actually broadcast on Chinese central television in the aftermath of 1989 to show the graciousness of the party and how it had failed to crush the lone protester out of magnanimity. So then the question becomes, well, how prevalent is this idea that China is a place rife with public secrecy? And so I began to look at the different images that I had, the different image works I had, and I found that they came back again and again to the same central point, that this mode of reckoning with the past is extremely widespread.
Other questions? Yeah, behind you. Yes.
The events that you use as your case studies are very different in terms of their duration and extent, and also in terms of how many people were involved. And I wonder whether you noticed any difference. I mean, is there a different kind of secrecy around the Cultural Revolution from around Tiananmen Square? Obviously these are different periods. Or again, the 1930s massacres. Do you think that deliberate forgetting or covering over happens in a different way when there has been a mass participation in the crimes, if you want to call it?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, for a start, you're right to raise the difference between these events because they're not commensurable at all. And one of the problems about using this case study approach is that you end up making the incommensurable look as if they can be easily compared when in fact they can't and shouldn't be. But what I noticed was that there are differences. For example, the way that public secrecy around Tank Man is treated is very humorous. It relies on comedy as a way of puncturing the illusion of the public secret, whereas other kinds of photo forms, particularly those which deal with the Cultural Revolution, tend to gravitate towards exploring the numinous capacity of these works, the sense in which they can induct us into some kind of spiritual encounter with the past. So there are certainly differences between them. And for example, another category of images I look at are family portraiture and how those are used to explore the secrets of the Cultural Revolution. And there, other sets of motifs arise, particularly the motif of the scar, for example. So there are quite sort of technical differences in how artists and filmmakers explore secrecy around these events. But what's consistent throughout is the notion of a conspiratorial silence, a silence in which everyone plays their role, which is highly participatory. That was uniform across all the case studies.
I think we will bring it to a close. I'd like to just ask one more question, though. Several times you've referred to your book, and I think one consequence of your conversation is that you've made a lot of people want to read that book. And I wonder, could you please tell us the title when published, and by whom?
I can't answer any of those questions, I'm afraid, Mark. I was actually expecting you to ask me a different question, namely, who's going to publish your book? And given that, given the furore about China Cambridge University Press and the China Quarterly earlier this year, no, I'm in discussion with a publisher, but I can't. And the publisher wants me to change the title, so that's up in the air as well.
Okay.
But it should be out, I hope, in 2019.
Right. Well, let's say thank you to